I honestly thought I was doing the right thing. That is the kind of pathetic, self-righteous opening that makes me want to scream at myself now, looking back at the wreckage of what used to be a life I was proud of. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for 6 years, living in that comfortable, slightly overpriced suburban house in Ohio that we spent every weekend painting or redecorating. It was the American dream in its most banal, beautiful form. We had the sensible sedan, the golden retriever named Cooper who shed on everything we owned, and a social calendar that mostly revolved around Friday night drinks with friends and Sunday brunches where we pretended we didn't have to work on Monday. Everything was fine. Better than fine. It was stable. And I have learned the hard way that when you think your life is perfectly stable, that is usually the exact moment it starts to tilt. Enter Mark. Mark wasn't just a friend. He was the guy who stood next to me at the altar. We had been inseparable since sophomore year of college, bonded by a shared love for craft beer, cynical humor, and an endless supply of stupid decisions that we somehow survived. When he called me 3 months ago, sounding like he had just been hit by a freight train, my heart sank. His long-term girlfriend had decided she wanted an open relationship, which is usually just a fancy way of saying she wanted to break up with him without the guilt. He was devastated, evicted from their apartment, and completely spiraling. I didn't even have to look at Sarah before I told him he had a place to stay. I told him he could crash on our couch for as long as he needed to get back on his feet. Sarah, being the incredible, empathetic person I thought she was, didn't even blink. She told me to tell him to bring his stuff over that night. The first few weeks were actually okay. Mark was a decent house guest, mostly staying out of the way, spending his evenings buried in his laptop or nursing a bourbon in the backyard. I was working late hours at the firm, chasing that promotion that felt like it was always just one more project away, and I genuinely appreciated having someone there to keep Sarah company while I was stuck in the office. It felt like the old days again, just the three of us hanging out on the patio, laughing about the idiocies of the people we worked with. I felt like a good guy. I felt like a good husband and a loyal friend. I didn't see the shifts in the atmosphere. I didn't see the way Sarah started wearing the perfume I used to have to beg her to put on just to go out to dinner. I didn't notice that she stopped asking me about my day and started asking Mark about his job interviews with this intensity that made my skin prickle, though I dismissed it as her being supportive. There was this specific Tuesday, a day I remember with such agonizing clarity that I can still feel the cold rain hitting the windshield of my car as I drove home. It was supposed to be a standard night. I had closed a big account, and for the first time in months, I had left the office before 7. I was going to stop at the liquor store, pick up a nice bottle of wine, and surprise Sarah. I wanted to thank her for being so patient with Mark and for being the rock that she always was. I remember pulling into the driveway and seeing that the lights were dimmed. That wasn't unusual, but the silence that hung over the house felt heavy, suffocating. I unlocked the front door and walked into the foyer, my heart light, my mind already rehearsing the joke I was going to tell about my boss. I set the wine on the entryway table and took off my coat. The house was quiet, but there was a sound coming from the living room, a low, rhythmic murmur. I figured they were watching a movie, probably some thriller that Sarah picked out while Mark sat there half asleep. I walked toward the living room, a smile already forming on my lips, ready to interrupt their quiet night. But as I rounded the corner, the words died in my throat. The living room was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of the television. But it wasn't a movie playing. It was one of those nature documentaries with the sound turned all the way down, just a wash of blue light casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Sarah wasn't on the couch. Mark wasn't on the couch. I stood there for a second, confused, my pulse quickening for reasons I couldn't articulate. I walked toward the kitchen, thinking maybe they were getting a snack, but the kitchen was empty. Then I heard it, a sharp, ragged intake of breath coming from the hallway that led to our bedroom. It wasn't the sound of a TV show. It was human. It was intimate. I felt this cold, sharp spike of adrenaline drill into my stomach. I walked toward the bedroom door, which was cracked open about 2 inches. I didn't plan on walking in. I didn't plan on doing anything other than figuring out what the hell was going on. But my hand moved on its own, pushing the door open just enough to see what was happening inside. I wish I could say I slammed the door and walked away. I wish I could say I did something heroic or composed. I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, like a man turned to salt. Sarah was there, sitting on the edge of our bed, and Mark was kneeling in front of her. They weren't even hiding it. It was so casual, so completely devoid of the shame I expected to see, that it made my brain misfire. I saw the way Sarah's hand was tangled in Mark's hair, the way her head was thrown back, her eyes closed in an expression of pure, unadulterated pleasure. It was a face I had seen 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with that kind of hunger. And Mark, my brother, the guy I'd been there for every single day for the last 2 months, was looking up at her with a look of possessive adoration that made my knees buckle. The world didn't go silent. It went loud. My ears were ringing with this high-pitched, piercing static that made it hard to breathe. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out of my throat was this pathetic, garbled choke that sounded like someone being strangled. That sound is what alerted them. Sarah's eyes flew open, and they snapped toward the door. The look on her face wasn't one of immediate horror or regret. It was the look of a child caught stealing candy from a jar. It was startled, yes, but beneath that, there was this lingering heat that she couldn't extinguish fast enough. Mark scrambled backward, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost, his mouth working silently, trying to find words that weren't there. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so violently that I couldn't even form a fist. I backed up until I hit the hallway wall, the hard plaster digging into my shoulders. I felt like I was watching a movie of someone else's life, some tragic, predictable plot I had seen 100 times. But this was my life. This was the woman I had built a home with, the woman I had planned to have kids with, the woman who knew every single one of my flaws and loved me anyway. Or so I thought. The betrayal wasn't just the act, it was the entire architecture of the last 3 months. Every dinner we ate, every laugh we shared, every night I came home to find them together on my couch. It was all a performance. It was a play, and I was the only person in the room who didn't know the script. Mark finally found his voice. He stood up, stumbling, and tried to step toward me, his hands raised in that universal gesture of peace that felt like the greatest insult of my entire life. "Don't," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "Don't you dare come near me." Sarah had finally pulled her robe closed, her face now a mask of frantic, desperate calculation. She looked at me, not with the look of a wife who had broken her vows, but with the look of a woman who was already trying to find a way to make this my fault. "You shouldn't have come home early," she said. It wasn't an apology. It was an accusation. Those 5 words hit me harder than a physical blow. They were the confession, the justification, and the end of everything I knew about her. She wasn't sorry she did it. She was sorry she got caught. And that realization, that specific, agonizing realization, is what finally shattered the part of me that wanted to believe this was all a terrible, fixable mistake. I looked at Mark, and I saw a man I didn't recognize. He was the same guy who had stood by me when my dad died, the same guy who knew the code to my safe, the guy who knew exactly what I was thinking just by the way I held my drink. And there he was, standing in my bedroom, looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. I turned around and walked out of the house. I didn't grab my keys, I didn't grab my phone, I didn't even grab my coat. I just walked out the front door and kept walking until the cold rain soaked through my shirt and I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I walked until the suburbs gave way to the industrial park on the edge of town, and I sat down on a wet bench and stared at the dark, empty road. My life had just ended, and the sun was going to rise in a few hours like nothing had happened. The hours I spent sitting on that wet bench in the industrial park felt like a lifetime of mourning. I watched the sky transition from a bruised, ink-black purple to a sickly gray dawn, the kind that makes everything in the world look cheap and artificial. My phone was vibrating in my pocket. I knew who it was. I didn't need to look at the screen to know that Sarah was blowing up my notifications with apologies, excuses, and probably some pathetic attempt at gaslighting that she had been workshopping in her head. I didn't answer. I didn't even turn it off. I just let it vibrate until the battery finally died, a small digital death that mirrored my own. When I finally stood up, my joints were screaming from the cold, and my mind felt like it had been scraped raw by a dull blade. I had to go back. I had to face the wreckage. I couldn't just vanish into the ether, even though every part of my survival instinct was begging me to drive until the gas tank ran dry and start over in a state where no one knew my name. When I pulled back into the driveway, the house looked different. The curtains were drawn tightly, the house sitting there like a silent accusatory box. My keys felt heavy in my hand, like lead. I walked inside, and the smell of the house hit me first, a mix of lavender laundry detergent and the lingering, sharp scent of his cologne. It made me want to rip the carpet out. I walked into the living room, and there they were. They were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, looking like two children sent to the principal's office. The air in the room was so thick with tension it felt like I was breathing through mud. Sarah looked like she hadn't slept at all. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. Mark looked miserable, but in that way people do when they're more concerned about their own comfort than the person they've betrayed. He stood up the moment I walked in, his mouth open as if he were about to launch into some rehearsed speech, but I held up a hand. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want the excuses about how I wasn't there enough, or how they didn't mean for it to happen, or how it was just a moment of weakness. I walked straight past them toward the stairs, not saying a word. I needed to pack a bag. I needed to get out of this house before I did something that would land me in a jail cell. I went into the bedroom, and it felt like walking into a crime scene. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started throwing things into it. Shirts, jeans, a pair of boots, my laptop. I wasn't thinking. I was just purging. I felt Sarah standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. She started to speak, her voice a fragile, broken whisper, but I ignored her. I grabbed my passport, my wallet, and the spare keys to my truck, my movements frantic and jerky. "You don't understand," she said, her voice finally finding some strength. "It wasn't like that. We were just lonely, and he was here, and it just happened. It was a mistake." I stopped what I was doing and turned to look at her. The fury was so hot in my chest that I could feel it radiating off my skin. "A mistake?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on the way home, Sarah. A mistake is missing an anniversary dinner because you got stuck at work. This is a choice. This is weeks, maybe months of choices. You didn't just fall into his bed. You walked into it. Every single day for 3 months, you looked me in the eye and you lied. You let me welcome him into our home. You let me trust him with our life. And you took that and you threw it in the trash like it meant absolutely nothing." Mark appeared behind her, looking like he was ready to step in, and that was the spark that ignited the bonfire. I pushed past my wife and walked straight up to him. He was a few inches shorter than me, and I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and slammed him against the hallway wall. The impact was loud, a thud that echoed through the house. I felt his breath hit my face, and for a second, I thought about breaking his nose. I really, truly wanted to just let go of all the restraint I'd spent my life cultivating and beat him until he looked as broken as I felt. But looking at him, I didn't see a villain. I saw a coward. I saw a man who had nothing and who had tried to steal the one thing I had built. The realization was so profound it almost made me laugh. I let him go, shoving him backwards so hard he stumbled into the coat rack. "Get out," I said, pointing toward the front door. "Get your things, get your car, and get the hell out of my house. And if I ever see you again, I promise you I won't be as calm as I am right now. I don't care if we were friends for 20 years. I don't care about the history. That died the second you decided you had a right to my wife." Mark didn't say a word. He didn't try to defend himself. He just scrambled to the guest room, probably sensing that I was hovering on the edge of a total psychological collapse. Sarah tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away as if she were covered in acid. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice cold and flat. "You lost the right to touch me, to speak to me, to even look at me, the second you opened this door to him." I waited in the living room, standing in the middle of the space where I'd spent so many nights relaxing, feeling like a complete stranger in my own home. I watched the clock on the wall, the rhythmic ticking sounding like a countdown to an explosion. Mark came out of the guest room carrying a duffel bag, his eyes on the floor. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at me. He just walked toward the door, his movements hurried and pathetic. When he reached for the handle, he paused. He looked back at me, and there was this strange, hollow look in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you." I just laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that felt like sandpaper in my throat. "You're not sorry you hurt me, Mark. You're sorry you got caught. There's a massive difference." He didn't respond. He just opened the door and walked out into the daylight. And just like that, a piece of my past was gone forever. I turned my attention back to Sarah. She was crying now, the ugly, gasping kind of crying that she used to do when she was genuinely upset about something insignificant. But watching her didn't trigger any of my old protective instincts. I didn't want to hold her. I didn't want to comfort her. I wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I picked up my bag and walked toward the front door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice hitching. "You can't just leave. We have to talk about this. We have to figure out how to move past this." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. "Move past this?" I repeated, turning back to look at her. "Sarah, there is no moving past this. There is only the version of you that I loved, and the version of you that is standing in front of me now. And I don't know who you are." I walked out of the house, the cool morning air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I got into my truck and drove, aimlessly, just letting the wheels turn and the engine hum. I found myself driving toward the highway, past the exit from my office, past the places we used to go for lunch. Every single building, every single street was tied to a memory. That cafe where we had our first date, the park where we walked the dog on Sunday mornings, the gym where we'd signed up for a membership together. It was a minefield of ghosts. I felt like I was being haunted by a life that no longer existed. My chest felt so tight that I had to roll down the windows, letting the wind whip through the cab just so I could remember to breathe. By midday, I pulled into a motel on the outskirts of the city, some dingy, low-budget place where you paid cash and no one asked questions. I went to my room, threw my bag on the floor, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The silence of the room was overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I was completely, utterly alone. I didn't have my best friend, I didn't have my wife, and I didn't have the life I had worked so hard to build. It was just me and the hum of the air conditioner. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the cars passing by outside as they flickered across the wall. I thought about the way Sarah looked at me before I left, not with regret, but with a kind of desperate, frantic need to regain control. She wasn't scared of losing me. She was scared of the consequences. She was scared of being the person who threw it all away. I closed my eyes and tried to force myself to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I saw them. I saw the way his hands were on her. I saw the way she looked at him. I saw the house, our home, turned into something dirty and shameful. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that was killing me. It was the realization that my entire reality was a lie. Had she been cheating on me the whole time? Was our marriage just a series of performances? Were our friends laughing at me behind my back while I played the happy, unsuspecting husband? The paranoia started to settle in, creeping into my brain like black mold. I started replaying every argument, every weird mood, every late night at work, wondering if I was the only one who didn't know the truth. It was a rabbit hole I couldn't climb out of. I stayed there for hours, just staring at the wall, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me, turning my heart into something hard and cold. As the sun began to set, casting long orange beams of light across the room, I finally pulled my phone out of my bag. It was dead, but I had a charger in my car. I went outside and plugged it in, sitting in the driver's seat while the battery slowly ticked upward. When it finally turned on, the screen lit up with notifications, dozens of texts from Sarah, missed calls from her mother, messages from friends asking where I was. I ignored them all, scrolling past them until I found what I was looking for. I opened my bank app. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to see if there was some other layer to the betrayal, some financial rot beneath the emotional one. I scrolled through our shared account, looking at the transactions from the last 3 months. Most of them were normal: groceries, gas, utilities.
But then I saw it. There were charges, small at first, then larger, consistently over the last 3 months. They were at restaurants I'd never been to, bars I'd never heard of, a boutique hotel downtown that was known for being discreet. I stared at the dates, matching them up in my head.
They were all on days when I was working late or when I was out of town for business. My heart started to race. I clicked on the details of one of the charges, and it linked to a credit card I didn't even know she had. It was a secondary card on an account I hadn't checked in years. I opened that statement, and my blood ran cold. There were thousands of dollars in charges. High-end dinners, gifts, hotel rooms. It wasn't just Mark. Or maybe it was. But the sheer scale of the financial deception was staggering. She wasn't just cheating on me with my best friend. She was funding a double life. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, so strong that I had to open the car door and lean out, gasping for air. The betrayal wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a calculated, long-term, systematic destruction of our life. She had been taking money from our savings, money we were supposed to be using for a down payment on a larger house, to pay for her affair. It was so cold, so cynical, that I couldn't even process it. I sat there in the dark parking lot, the sound of the highway roaring in the distance, feeling the last remnants of my empathy for her evaporate. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a cheating wife. I was dealing with a stranger who had been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and laughing at my expense while she systematically dismantled everything I held dear. I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt nothing but a sharp, clear, cold resolve.
The cold realization that this wasn't just a physical betrayal, but a calculated financial dismantling of our life changed something fundamental in my marrow. It shifted the narrative from a tragedy of lost love to a cold-blooded thriller, where I was the primary victim. I didn't head back to the motel room. Instead, I drove. I drove for hours, aimlessly, just letting the interstate consume the miles. I stopped at a 24-hour gas station in the middle of nowhere, grabbed a stale cup of coffee, and sat in the fluorescent, buzzing hum of the parking lot, staring at the financial statements on my phone until the numbers started to blur into a terrifying code. She hadn't just been sleeping with my best friend. She had been paying for it with the money we were supposed to use for our future. It was a level of disrespect so deep, it felt like a physical violation of my autonomy. I realized then that I couldn't just walk away and let this be a sad story about a broken heart. There had to be a reckoning. I spent the rest of the night in that truck, not sleeping, but documenting everything. I took screenshots of every unauthorized transaction, every date, every suspicious charge that overlapped with the times I was supposedly too busy to notice anything. I was compiling a case file against the woman I had promised to protect for the rest of my life. It felt robotic, which was the only way I could stay functional. If I allowed myself to actually feel the weight of it, the thousands of dollars, the nights she pretended to be at a book club while she was actually at a high-end hotel with Mark, I would have collapsed. So I pushed it down. I packed it into a dark corner of my mind and focused entirely on the evidence. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. I didn't go home, but I did go back into the city. I went to a lawyer, a guy I knew from a college fraternity who specialized in brutal, no-nonsense divorces. I didn't tell him about the history or the friendship. I just showed him the bank statements and the timeline I had meticulously built throughout the night. His expression didn't change, but his eyes lit up in that way lawyers do when they see a slam-dunk case. He told me that if I wanted to scorch the earth, I was standing in the right place. We filed the papers that afternoon. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a comprehensive audit of every lie she had told for the last 4 months. I knew it would destroy her reputation, and frankly, I didn't care. The next 3 days were a blur of meetings, legal filings, and the terrifying, hollow silence of living out of a suitcase in a corporate apartment I'd rented in the center of the city. I didn't call home. I didn't answer the dozens of frantic texts or the sobbing voicemails she left on my phone. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was an adversary. I had to go back to the house to retrieve some of my belongings, and the thought of it made me want to vomit. I decided to do it while I knew she would be at work. I pulled up to the driveway, and the house felt even more alien than it had before. It was just a structure, a collection of wood and nails that held memories that were now toxic. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was that she hadn't touched anything. It was exactly as I had left it. Even the robe she was wearing when I walked in on them was discarded on the armchair. It was as if she were waiting for me to walk back in and pretend nothing had happened. I went to the bedroom and started packing my things, my books, my clothes, the small trinkets I'd collected over the years. I found a box of old photos in the back of the closet, pictures of us from vacations, dinners, and holidays. I looked at the smiling, happy faces in those photos and felt absolutely nothing. It was like looking at a stranger's photo album. I realized that the woman I loved never really existed. She was a mask that Sarah wore, and the real person had been hiding underneath, waiting for a chance to sabotage everything. I was in the middle of folding a sweater when I heard the front door open. My heart didn't race, it just dropped. I didn't move. I kept packing until she walked into the bedroom. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. Her eyes were hollowed out, her skin pale, and she was wearing the same clothes from the day I left. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of that old, familiar softness. But then it hardened into a desperate, frantic intensity. I didn't say a word. I just kept folding. "You can't do this," she said, her voice raspy. "You can't just throw away 6 years because of one mistake. We can fix this." I didn't even look up at her. I just kept packing. "One mistake?" I repeated, my voice steady, devoid of the rage that had consumed me earlier. She walked closer, her hands reaching out as if to touch my shoulder, but she stopped when I turned my head and gave her a look that I hoped was as icy as a winter grave. "Sarah," I said, "I have filed for divorce. My lawyer has all the documentation regarding the financial infidelity. You should probably contact someone who handles white-collar crime, or at least someone who can explain to you that you don't get to keep the lifestyle you destroyed." The look on her face wasn't just shock. It was a dawning, terrifying realization of what I had actually done. She wasn't just losing a husband, she was losing everything. She began to cry, but this time it felt like a performance. She was pleading, promising that she'd pay me back, that she'd change, that she'd go to therapy. It was sickening. I watched her, this woman I had once thought was my soulmate, groveling on the floor of our bedroom, and I realized that I had finally, truly moved on. I didn't feel anger, and I certainly didn't feel love. I felt pity. It was the most condescending, detached feeling I'd ever experienced. "You really think this is about the money?" I asked, my voice calm. "You think I'm walking away because of a few grand? I'm walking away because I don't know who you are. I don't know what you like, what you hate, or why you did any of this. The person I married is gone, if she was ever even there to begin with." I left her sitting on the floor, surrounded by my empty drawers and the echoes of a life that was now officially dead. I didn't look back as I walked out of that house. I didn't even check to see if she was following me. I got into my car and just drove. I felt lighter than I had in months, but there was this lingering, haunting question that I couldn't shake. I drove until the sun went down, stopping at a small roadside diner miles away from anything I knew. I sat in a booth and ordered a burger I didn't eat, just thinking about everything that had happened. I had won the battle, sure, but at what cost? I was alone. I was starting over in my late 30s, with nothing but a bitter taste in my mouth and a mountain of legal paperwork. But then, I thought about Mark. I hadn't heard a word from him since he walked out the door. I hadn't seen his name pop up on my phone, hadn't received a single apology from him other than the pathetic mutterings he gave me that morning. I realized that my anger towards him wasn't even about the betrayal. It was about the fact that he hadn't even had the guts to face me. He had used me, taken my hospitality, and then scurried away like a rat when the lights turned on. I knew I couldn't just let him off the hook that easily. He had been a part of my life for 20 years, and he didn't just get to walk away without a word. I pulled out my phone and found his number, the one I had saved in my contacts for half a lifetime. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for the first time, I felt that familiar, hot rush of adrenaline. I wasn't going to be the victim anymore. I was going to be the one who decided how this story ended. I didn't call Mark to yell or scream. That would have been too much of a relief for him. I wanted to do something that would linger,
something that would make him feel the same slow-burning anxiety that he had forced onto me for the last 3 months. I waited until late, the kind of hour where the world feels small and vulnerable. I texted him a single, simple message. We need to talk about the money. I didn't mention the betrayal. I didn't mention the bedroom or the affair. I just mentioned the money, knowing full well that a guy like Mark, who was currently living out of a duffel bag and probably had less than $1,000 to his name, would immediately assume I had uncovered every single one of his secrets. I wasn't wrong. The 3 dots signifying he was typing appeared, stayed for a full minute, and then vanished. He didn't respond. He didn't call. He just went silent. A coward's final retreat. That was the last time I thought about trying to engage with him. The realization hit me then, standing in the cold parking lot of that diner, that he didn't deserve any more of my time. He was a footnote in a life that was finally mine again. I turned my phone off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I was finished with the games. I was finished with the people who had treated my loyalty like a weakness to be exploited. I drove away from the diner, heading west, toward a city where no one knew my name, and no one had a history with me. The road stretched out ahead of me, a black ribbon cutting through the darkness, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was actually moving toward something, instead of just running away from something else. The months that followed were a surreal, quiet reconstruction of my own identity. I moved into a small, functional apartment in a city where the streets were loud and anonymous. I started a new job, one where I didn't have to worry about climbing a corporate ladder or impressing people who didn't care about me. I spent my mornings running, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, reminding me that I was still here, still solid, still breathing. It wasn't easy. There were nights where I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that night in our bedroom playing on a loop behind my eyelids. There were days where the silence of my apartment felt like a crushing weight, and I'd have to force myself to go outside, to talk to a barista, to buy groceries, just to remind myself that I was still a part of the world. But the anger eventually dulled. It stopped being a sharp, piercing pain and settled into a quiet, manageable hum. I realized that my survival wasn't dependent on their punishment, nor was it dependent on an apology that would never come. It was dependent on my ability to let go of the anger that had been poisoning my blood. I started going to the gym again, with intensity. I started reading books I had abandoned, cooking meals that I actually enjoyed, and finding hobbies that had nothing to do with the life I used to live. I was building a new life, brick by brick, entirely on my own terms. It was a selfish, solitary existence, but it was mine. And for the first time, I wasn't living for anyone else's validation. Then came the letter. It arrived 6 months later, postmarked from my old town. It was from Sarah. I stared at the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside were a dozen pages of frantic, messy handwriting. She talked about the divorce, about how she had lost her job, about how she had reached out to Mark only to find out he had left town shortly after I sent that text, and how she had hit rock bottom. She wrote about how sorry she was, about how she realized she had thrown away the only person who had ever truly loved her. She asked for a chance to talk, to explain, to apologize. She said she had changed, that she was in therapy, that she had learned so much about herself. I read it all in one sitting, sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee. When I finished, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel vindication. I felt a profound sense of closure. She was right about one thing. She had changed. She had been forced to face the reality of the person she had become, and it had destroyed her. But that didn't change the past. It didn't change the fact that she had looked me in the eye and lied every single day, or that she had treated our marriage like a disposable commodity. I took the letter, folded it back up, and walked over to the trash can. I dropped it inside and walked away. I didn't respond. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. I look back at the person I was back then, that guy who was so worried about his job, his house, his perfect suburban life, and I barely recognize him. He was naive, I suppose, but he was also happy. And even though that happiness was built on a foundation of sand, it was real to him at the time. I don't regret that life, and I don't regret the mistakes I made in choosing the people I trusted. What I regret is that I let them define me for so long. I let their betrayal become the center of my existence, and it took me a long time to realize that I was the one who had the power to redefine what that betrayal meant. I'm sitting on my balcony now, watching the sunset over a city that I finally call home. It's a beautiful evening, the kind where the air feels electric and full of possibility. I have a life that is simple, clean, and entirely mine. I don't have a golden retriever, and I don't have a spouse who knows my deepest, darkest secrets. But I have my peace. And after everything I've been through, after the wreckage of that house in Ohio and the long, bitter road of the divorce, I've realized that peace is the most valuable thing I could have ever asked for. The story of my betrayal, the story of Sarah and Mark, it's all just a memory now, a dark, distorted lesson in the volatility of human nature. I'm not the man who was cheated on anymore. I'm the man who walked through the fire and came out on the other side, and that is a story I'm finally proud to tell. I didn't break, and in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The past is gone. The dust has settled, and for the first time in a long time, the future is completely, beautifully, and terrifyingly open.
যাবার সে যাবে চলে তারে নিয়া ভাইবো না তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা যে যাবার সে যাবে চলে তারে নিয়া ভাইবো না তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা এত ভালোবাসার পরেও পাইলাম না তার মন আমারে সারিয়া বেঈমান ধরছে আরেকজন হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া যাকে তাকে দেখে তাহার লেগে যায় রে ভালা মুখে তাহার মধু অন্তর বিষেতে ভরা যাকে তাকে দেখে তাহার লেগে যায় রে ভালা মুখে তাহার মধু অন্তর বিষেতে ভরা মিষ্টি কথার মায়া জালে কইরা আমন্ত্রণ আমার কলজা খাওয়ায় তাদের কইরা নিমন্ত্রণ হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া বারো গাটের পানি যাহার খাইয়াই অবস্থ এক গাটেতে সে কিভাবে থাকবে রে অস্ত 12 গাটের পানি যাহার খাইয়াই অবস্থ এক গাটেতে সে কিভাবে থাকবে রে অস্ত তাহার কাছে ভালোবাসার নাই রে কোনো দাম আমার মনটা ভাঙ্গা বেঈমান করলো রে খান খান হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া যে যাবার সে চলে যাবে তারে নিয়া ভাইব না তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা যে যাবার সে চলে যাবে তারে নিয়া ভাইব না তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা এত ভালোবাসার পরেও পাইলাম না তার মন আমারে সারিয়া বেঈমান ধরছে আর একজন হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া